The planet Vera 9 was unforgiving. Its deserts stretched endlessly, painted in deep reds and burnt oranges, and the sun scorched everything it touched. Winds here were more than just wind. They were a living force, sharp as knives, with sand. Particles so fine and fast that even steel could be shredded if left unprotected. Every settler knew this. Every species knew this. And yet they had built shelters that seemed to defy nature itself. Towering domes of shining alloys, reinforced by energy shields and technology that could withstand almost anything. The settlement looked like a city born from the stars, a monument to alien ingenuity. But then came Mason Carter, a human from Earth, and everything changed. Not immediately, but in ways no one expected. Mason was small in stature compared to most Veran settlers, but his eyes held a spark that could not be ignored. He arrived late to the colony, alone, carrying nothing more than a few simple tools, some bags of seeds, and an unshakable determination. While other settlers had brought advanced machines, hovering equipment, and intricate blueprints for expanding the settlement, Mason had clay, stones, and wood. Simple, humble materials that seemed almost laughable in comparison to the gleaming domes surrounding him. He chose a quiet spot on the edge of the settlement where the desert stretched unbroken for miles. With careful hands, he began to build. Layer by layer, he stacked clay mixed with plant fibers to create a durable, flexible wall. He packed sand tightly into its base, carved narrow windows to block the harsh wind, and shaped the roof to angle low, so the storm would slide over it instead of smashing it down. To an onlooker, it looked nothing like the futuristic shelters of the other species. It looked primitive. The aliens noticed almost immediately. The Dravari, proud insectoid engineers with carapaces shining under Vera's twin suns, were the first to arrive, their long limbs clicking together as they approached. "Human," one hissed. "What are you doing? That structure looks like it belongs in a forgotten mud village, not a galactic colony." The Thalran, amphibious beings, with shimmering scales that reflected the desert's heat, joined in, their voices a chorus of disbelief. "Why use such primitive materials? You have technology at your fingertips. Why choose this? Why live in dirt when the rest of us thrive in alloy domes?" Mason didn't answer with words. He only smiled faintly, continuing his work. His hands were steady, patient, almost meditative. Day after day he molded, packed, and shaped, never rushing, never pausing to defend himself. Other settlers whispered behind his back, spreading jokes about the human who thought he could survive in the desert with nothing but mud and clay. Some even bet on how long it would last before the wind tore it apart. Yet Mason was not deterred. Each evening he would sit on the low roof of his shelter and look out at the endless dunes. The sun would set in a fiery blaze, casting long shadows over the sand, and he would whisper to himself, almost as if speaking to the desert itself, "Storms don't care about pride. They only care if you're ready." And in his heart, he truly believed it. Unlike the other settlers who trusted only in technology, Mason trusted in adaptation, in the knowledge passed down through generations on a planet where storms were not tamed by shields or alloys, but by human resilience, ingenuity, and patience. Every clay wall he molded, every fiber he mixed, every low-angled roof he carved was built with purpose, built with understanding, built with a respect for the desert that the aliens could not comprehend. At first, the colony ignored him. They continued building higher domes, installing more advanced shields and laughing at his tiny hut. But Mason's eyes, calm and focused, hinted at something deeper. He was not just building a shelter. He was building a promise that, no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how arrogant the others, he would survive, and the desert was watching. Days passed and Mason's small shelter began to take its full shape. The clay walls, thick and sun-baked, stood quietly against the wind. The roof, angled low, glimmered faintly under Vera 9's twin suns. To Mason it was perfect, not because it looked impressive, but because it was designed to survive, to endure, to protect. The aliens, however, could not see past their pride. Each day, groups of settlers would pass by the human's hut and snicker. The Dravari engineers clicked their mandibles, voices full of mockery. "Look at him," one said. "He spends all day with his hands in dirt. Does he think clay will save him when the storms arrive?" The Thalran would lean over, their iridescent scales flashing under the sun, and add, "A human, stubborn as a rock, and yet so foolish. His shelter is nothing but a pile of earth. It will collapse the moment the wind rises." Even the youngest aliens joined in. Small Dravari children would dart near Mason's hut, throwing sand clumps at the walls, giggling as the human calmly brushed them aside. Mason never raised his voice, never yelled, never showed anger. He only continued his work, humming softly to himself as he packed the clay tighter, smoothed the walls, and checked every corner of his humble home. One evening, the tallest of the Thalran, a wise elder named Sahrin, walked to Mason and asked, voice dripping with skepticism, "Human, why do you waste your time? All of us will be safe inside our domes. They are powered, shielded, and built by our best architects. Why risk your life with this dirt hut?" Mason looked up from the mud he was pressing into the wall, his hands dusted with sand, and replied, simply, "I am not risking. I am preparing. Technology can fail. Pride can fail. But the earth teaches lessons older than any dome. It does not lie. It does not boast. It survives." Sahrin blinked, confused by the calm certainty in Mason's tone. Around them, other settlers snickered quietly. "Listen to him," one said. "He pretends to know the desert, but he is nothing compared to our shields." The human only smiled faintly and returned to work. He shaped the clay with precise movements, pressing it firmly into place, layering each wall like he had done countless times back on Earth. He reinforced the corners with a mixture of fibers and sand, carved small slits for windows just wide enough to let in light but narrow enough to block the wind, and covered the roof with tightly woven mats to prevent erosion. Every detail had a purpose. Every detail was tested by knowledge and experience, not by the shine of machines or the hum of energy. At night, the other settlers would gather inside their domes, laughing quietly about the human stubbornness. They would tell stories of how the hut would surely collapse, how Mason would be forced to beg for shelter when the first storm arrived. They did not see his quiet confidence, the way he studied the shifting dunes, the winds, the slow patterns of the desert. Mason, alone in the soft glow of his lantern, would sit outside looking at the endless horizon. The wind was always present here, a whisper, a warning. He whispered back almost as if speaking to the desert itself, "I am ready when the storm comes. You will see." Even the younger settlers noticed something in him, his calmness, his patience, the quiet way he worked tirelessly, never complaining, never showing fear. A few began to feel doubt about their domes, which relied so heavily on power and technology. Could it be that Mason, the human they mocked, truly understood the desert better than they did? But their pride kept them silent. They laughed. They mocked. They dismissed the human. And all the while, Mason worked, knowing that soon the desert would speak, and the storm would decide who had truly prepared. The first whispers of danger began to stir in the horizon, but the aliens were too busy celebrating their arrogance to notice. Mason, however, had already seen the change in the sky, the clouds forming dark and low, carrying the scent of a storm unlike any before. He touched the clay walls of his shelter and said quietly, "Soon, soon you will see." And with that, he returned to work, calm, patient, and unshakable, while the rest of the colony laughed at his human stubbornness, not knowing that the desert was already waiting for them. The horizon began to darken like a slow bruise spreading across the desert sky. What started as faint streaks of crimson clouds quickly grew into thick, roiling masses that swallowed the twin suns of Vera 9. The air became heavy, charged with electricity carrying the sharp smell of ozone and hot sand. Mason sensed it immediately. He had seen storms before, but this one was different. It wasn't just a storm, it was a monster, vast and alive, stretching across the desert like a wall of fury. Inside the settlement, the aliens first noticed. The change when their weather monitors began to scream warnings. Red lights flashed. Alarms echoed through the domes. Category 9 storm approaching. The automated voice warned in multiple languages. Estimated wind velocity, 800 kilometers per hour. Seek maximum shelter immediately. Panic spread like wildfire. The Dravari clicked their mandibles in alarm. The Thalaran's shimmering scales reflected fear as they hurried toward the dome's safety doors. Even the youngest settlers, small creatures with soft wings or delicate limbs, scrambled desperately, seeking the comfort of walls and shields. And then their eyes fell on Mason. His hut, small, low and simple, seemed fragile compared to the colossal domes around it. Its clay walls and woven roof looked like they could crumble under a light breeze, let alone the monstrous winds now creeping closer. The aliens could not believe it. "Human, you will die," shouted a young Dravari engineer, panic in his voice. "Come to the dome, we have shields, energy barriers, your hut will not survive." Mason only shook his head. Calm and composed, he walked to the small door of his shelter and gently tapped the clay walls. "It will survive," he said softly. "The storm tests those who are prepared, not those who are proud." The settlers stared, baffled. Many thought he was crazy. How could a human, with nothing but earth and clay, possibly endure a storm that threatened to tear apart their advanced domes? They could hear the wind picking up in the distance, a deep, groaning roar that made the ground tremble. It sounded almost alive, like some ancient beast stretching its limbs before attacking. The colony leaders, proud and arrogant, waved Mason away. "You don't understand, human. Technology protects us. Shields, alloys, force fields, these are what matter. Your hut is nothing." Mason's gaze drifted toward the desert. He could see the sand rising like mountains in the distance, curling and twisting as the wind sculpted it. The first hints of the storm were approaching faster than any forecast could predict. He walked back into his hut and checked every wall, every corner, every slit for windows. He tightened the mats on the roof, packed sand against the base, and whispered quietly, "Soon." Meanwhile, the aliens continued to argue among themselves. Some doubted the storm would reach their settlement. Others argued that their shields could withstand anything. Pride blinded them. They laughed at the human, as always, thinking he was merely exaggerating the danger. But Mason did not laugh. He remembered Earth's deserts, Earth's storms, and the countless lessons learned from survival in harsh lands. Humans were not the strongest in technology, not the tallest in stature, and not the most powerful in the galaxy, but they had adaptability, patience, and the wisdom to endure when others failed. As the winds began to howl at the edges of the settlement, tossing sand like tiny daggers, Mason stood at the doorway of his shelter. The air vibrated with the growing fury of the storm. The domes around him began to hum under stress, shields flaring as they fought against the relentless wind. The first raindrops of sand fell, stinging like fire on exposed skin. The aliens finally realized, perhaps too late, that this storm was unlike anything they had faced. And in that moment, Mason's quiet confidence seemed almost otherworldly. His small, unassuming hut, built from humble clay and stone, stood quietly as if mocking the chaos around it. The storm was coming, and Mason was ready. The storm arrived like a living monster. The sky vanished under a wall of sand and darkness, and the twin suns were swallowed by a furious, swirling cloud. The wind screamed with unimaginable force, rattling the domes and whipping sand in sharp arcs that could slice through unprotected skin. The desert itself seemed alive, bending, twisting, and raging against everything in its path. Inside the grand domes, panic erupted. Alarms blared, warning lights flashed, and energy shields flared, struggling to contain the destructive power. Outside, the settlers huddled together, fear etched on their faces. The Dravari clicked nervously, their mandibles trembling. The Thalran's scales shimmered under stress, reflecting sparks from overloaded energy grids. Even the youngest creatures, small and delicate, cried in terror as the domes groaned under the pressure. Yet outside, on the edge of the settlement, Mason's small hut stood firm. Its thick clay walls shivered but did not break. The low roof angled the wind harmlessly over its surface, and the narrow windows allowed no sand inside. Mason sat quietly inside, lantern glowing softly, watching the storm as it roared across the desert. He felt the vibrations through the ground, felt the air slice past, but he did not panic. He had built for this, trained for this, and he knew every curve and crack of his humble shelter. The first dome faltered. Sparks flew as the energy shield buckled under the relentless assault of wind and sand. A loud, terrifying crack split the air as the walls twisted and began to tear apart. Alien settlers screamed, some trapped inside as the dome collapsed like a fallen tree, metal bending, panels breaking, and sand pouring in like a river. Another dome followed. Its shining walls, once a symbol of pride and technology, were ripped, open by the storm, tossing debris into the air. The settlers inside were thrown to the ground, their screams carried away by the wind. The protective technology that had seemed invincible only moments ago was useless against the raw, unyielding power of nature, and all the while, Mason's hut endured. The storm rolled over it, winds sliding across its roof, swirling around its walls, testing its strength, but the clay held. The fibers packed in the walls absorbed shock. The sand at its base anchored it firmly to the ground. The windows remained tight, the interior dry and safe. Outside, the aliens could only watch in disbelief. Some crawled through debris to reach Mason's shelter, shouting, "How is this possible?" Their pride had led them to believe that height, shine, and technology were the ultimate protection. Now they saw the truth. Simplicity, patience, and understanding of nature could outperform all of their machines. Inside the hut, Mason's calm was unwavering. He knew the storm would eventually pass, and when it did, only those prepared would survive. The small fire in his lantern flickered but did not go out. His water supply was untouched. His carefully packed supplies remained intact. Every element of his preparation was working exactly as it should. As the hours passed, the storm raged with relentless fury. The sand whipped like needles, the wind screamed like 1,000 beasts, and the domes continued to fall one by one. Yet the little human shelter remained standing, an island of stability, in a sea of chaos. By nightfall, the storm began to weaken slightly. Its roar lessened, but the destruction it left behind was unimaginable. The proud, towering domes lay shattered, twisted metal and broken shields scattered across the desert floor. Survivors emerged from the wreckage, battered, humiliated, and terrified, their arrogance stripped away by the storm's unrelenting force. And on the edge of the settlement, Mason opened the door to his hut. His calm presence, his small, resilient shelter became a beacon of hope amid the destruction. For the first time, the aliens looked at him not with mockery but with fear, awe, and a dawning understanding. The storm had spoken, and Mason had listened. When the storm finally passed, a deafening silence fell over Vera 9. The once bustling settlement lay in ruins, buried under shifting dunes of sand and debris. Towering domes, symbols of alien pride and technological prowess, were shattered, bent, or completely collapsed. Energy shields flickered and died, leaving broken panels and twisted metal scattered across the desert like the carcasses of fallen beasts. The survivors emerged slowly, cautiously. Their bodies bore scratches, bruises, and burns. Some were limping, others carried the injured. Panic still lingered in their eyes, but fear now mingled with disbelief. They looked around, trying to understand what had happened, and their gaze eventually fell on a small figure on the edge of the settlement. Mason's shelter stood untouched. The clay walls were intact, the low roof unbroken, and a faint plume of smoke rose from the small chimney. The hut looked almost alive in its resilience, like it had absorbed the storm's rage and returned unscathed. The aliens froze. The human, whom they had mocked and laughed at, had survived while their grand domes had fallen. The first to move were the younger aliens, the ones who had once mocked Mason openly. They crawled through the sand toward the hut, their movements hesitant and fearful. They expected the walls to crumble under their touch, but they did not. They reached the door and hesitated, unsure if they were welcome. Mason opened it slowly, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "Come in," he said quietly, his voice steady, almost soothing. "There is room enough for everyone." The Dravari engineers were next. Their mandibles clicked nervously as they stepped over broken metal and sand dunes. One muttered under his breath, "Impossible? How?" They had relied on technology, on shields, on pride, and yet they had failed. Now they were faced with the undeniable proof that Mason's humble shelter had endured. The Thalron followed, their shimmering scales dulled with dust and exhaustion. They kept glancing at the hut, disbelief written across every line of their faces. Mason welcomed them too, guiding the injured and the frightened inside. The warmth of the small fire, the dryness of the supplies, and the calm assurance of the humans seemed almost magical after the storm's relentless fury. For the first time, the aliens experienced humility. They realized their pride had been their downfall. They had believed that size, shine, and technology could protect them from nature's wrath. But nature did not respect pride. It did not favor arrogance. It only tested preparation, adaptability, and respect for its power. Mason moved quietly among the survivors, checking injuries, distributing water, and offering words of comfort. He did not boast, nor did he gloat. He simply did what humans had done for centuries: survive, help others, and endure. The survivors began to whisper among themselves. Stories of the storm had traveled fast through the settlement before it passed. But now the truth was undeniable. The human who had been laughed at, the human they had mocked and dismissed, had built a shelter that outlasted their domes. His patience, wisdom, and understanding of the desert had saved them all. Some aliens, their voices trembling, finally asked the question they had been afraid to voice during the storm. How did you survive this when our domes fell?" Mason looked around the small, crowded shelter, at the injured and terrified faces of those who had once mocked him. He smiled faintly, his eyes calm, his voice steady. "You built to fight the storm. I built to live with it. Tall walls break first. Proud domes fall fastest. My shelter bends with the wind, absorbs its power, and endures. That is all." Silence fell over the hut. The survivors could not argue. They had witnessed the truth with their own eyes. The storm had stripped away their arrogance and left only humility and awe. Outside, the desert remained vast and unforgiving. But inside Mason's small human shelter, there was warmth, safety, and a quiet sense of hope. For the first time, the aliens understood what humans had always known. Survival depended not on pride or power, but on patience, ingenuity, and the willingness to endure when all else failed. And so, in that tiny clay hut on the edge of Vera 9, the aliens who had once mocked a human learned their first lesson in humility. They crawled, exhausted and beaten, into a home they had called worthless, and discovered the strength and resilience of humanity. The storm had passed, leaving the desert quiet, dusty, and eerily still. The once proud settlement was a landscape of broken domes, twisted metal, and scattered supplies. The aliens who survived the storm huddled inside Mason's small clay hut, their bodies exhausted, their minds numb with disbelief. They could hardly speak. The reality of what had happened was overwhelming. For days they had laughed at the human. They had pointed at his tiny, primitive hut and called it worthless. They had mocked his stubbornness, his refusal to rely on advanced technology, and his insistence on doing things the old way. And yet here they were, inside the shelter that had survived what their mighty domes could not. Finally, one of the Dravari engineers, his mandibles trembling with a mixture of fear and awe, spoke. "Human, how? How did this thing survive the storm when everything else fell?" Mason looked around the small space. The fire flickered, casting warm light on the tired, sand-streaked faces of the aliens. He could see the pride they had once carried, stripped away by the storm, replaced now by a fragile humility. He sighed quietly, choosing his words carefully. "You built to fight the storm," he said, his voice calm, steady. You made your domes tall, shiny, and strong, thinking they would resist the wind. You trusted in power, in shields, in technology. But tall walls fall first. Proud structures break hardest. Your domes were like castles in the sky, and the storm reminded you that the sky does not bow to pride. The aliens exchanged glances, silence filling the hut. Some looked away, ashamed. They realized he spoke the truth. They had built for display, for power, for comfort, not for survival. I did not fight the storm, Mason continued. I lived with it. I listened to it. I respected it. Every wall, every window, every layer of clay and sand was built to bend with the wind, to absorb its fury, and to endure. I did not try to dominate nature. I learned from it. A young Thalrun, her scales dull and covered with sand, whispered, We thought we knew how to survive here. Mason nodded. You knew how to protect yourselves with machines. But survival is not about machines. It is about understanding, patience, and respect. You cannot control nature. You can only prepare for it, adapt to it, and endure it. He walked to one of the walls and pressed his hand against the clay. This is why I built this way. Not because it looks impressive, not because it shows strength, but because it works, because it survives. You laughed at it, you mocked it, and the storm proved you wrong. The hut was quiet again, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Slowly, the aliens began to understand. Their pride had been their weakness. Mason's simplicity had been his strength. The human they had dismissed, the one they had underestimated, had survived where they had failed. Some began to ask questions, timidly at first. Can you teach us? Can we build like this? Mason smiled faintly. Yes, but you must learn more than the materials. You must learn patience, observation, respect for the desert and its power. Technology is useful, but it cannot replace understanding. One by one, the survivors began to help him reinforce the shelter, learning how the walls had been packed, how the windows were carved, how the roof was angled to let the storm pass harmlessly. It was hard work, but unlike the hurried assembly of their domes, this work was deliberate, thoughtful, and meaningful. Outside, the desert remained harsh, vast, and unforgiving. The wind still whispered over the dunes, reminding everyone of its power. But inside the small human shelter, there was warmth, safety, and hope. For the first time, the aliens understood a lesson that humans had learned long ago. Survival is never about pride or power. It is about patience, adaptation, and resilience. And in that humble clay hut on the edge of Vera 9, humanity's quiet, wisdom shone brighter than any dome, any shield, or any machine. The desert was quiet now. The storm had passed, leaving the settlement in ruin. Vera 9's once proud domes lay shattered across the sands, their metal frames twisted, shields broken, and interiors flooded with sand and debris. The aliens, battered and exhausted, were slowly gathering themselves. Many were injured, some weeping, some silent with shock. All of them, without exception, carried a new understanding in their eyes, a mix of awe, fear, and humility. And there, on the edge of the settlement, stood Mason's hut. Small, humble, unassuming, yet stronger than any dome, more resilient than any shield, more enduring than any machine. The clay walls, reinforced with fiber and sand, had withstood the storm. The roof, low and angled, had shed the wind's fury. Inside, the human sat quietly, tending the small fire that had kept warm even through the raging tempest. One by one, the aliens approached the hut. Their steps were slow, hesitant, as if they were stepping into sacred ground. The Dravari engineers, their pride stripped away, whispered, It survived. How? Mason looked at them calmly, his hands resting on his knees. Because I built to endure, not to impress, he said. Because I respected the storm, not challenged it. Technology is useful, but wisdom is stronger. Strength is measured by patience, not pride. The Thalrun elder, Sarin, finally spoke aloud, his voice shaking. We were wrong. We laughed at you. We mocked your shelter. And the storm has shown us the truth. Humans understand survival in ways we could not imagine. Mason nodded gently. Survival is never about who has the tallest walls or the brightest shields. It is about understanding the environment, respecting it, and preparing with care. That is why my shelter stands while yours fell. A quiet hush fell over the hut. The younger aliens, who had once teased Mason, looked down at their hands, ashamed. Slowly, they began to help him reinforce the hut. They mixed clay and fibers, packed sand around the walls, and carved small windows to protect from the wind. Mason guided them, teaching patiently. It was hard work, deliberate work, but every strike of the hands, every careful layer of clay, became a lesson in humility and resilience. Outside, the desert was harsh and still, but inside there was warmth, safety, and understanding. The aliens began to speak quietly among themselves, sharing stories of their failures, of how technology had betrayed them, of how their pride had blinded them. And Mason listened, offering advice, encouragement, and the calm presence that had kept them alive. By the following morning, word had begun to spread across the settlement. Aliens from other parts of the colony came to see the human shelter that had survived. They saw its simple walls, low roof, and narrow windows. And they saw something more, a testament to patience, wisdom, and the quiet strength of humanity. No one laughed at Mason's hut anymore. Instead, they asked to learn, to understand, to adopt the methods that had kept him safe. They realized that humans were not the strongest, the tallest, or the most advanced, but they were adaptable, resourceful, and unyielding when faced with danger. Mason stepped outside his shelter and looked at the sunrise over the desert. The sand dunes glowed gold in the morning light, and the wind whispered softly across the empty ruins of the fallen domes. He smiled faintly, knowing that the aliens now understood a truth humans had known for centuries. Survival is not about pride or power. It is about endurance, wisdom, and the ability to adapt. And so, on Vera 9, a tiny human hut became a legend, a symbol of strength without arrogance, patience without pride, and wisdom without boast. The aliens rebuilt their settlement, not with towering domes or fragile shields, but with low, sturdy structures inspired by humanity's enduring ingenuity. From that day forward, the desert whispered a new story, one that would be told for generations. The story of the human who built a shelter the storm could not destroy. The story of the night when the storm roared and pride fell, but patience, humility, and human resilience endured. In the end, it was not technology that survived. It was humanity.